So we'll go ahead and just get started. Just wanted people to know that some of the content is very difficult. So please be mindful of that and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. I certainly cropped out more of the some of the more deeply disturbing images, but I wanted to just give that trigger warning. So if we look at the next slide, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the learning objectives and some things that I hope that you'll be able to take away from this presentation. I'll briefly talk to you about what domestic minor sex trafficking is, the definition, and then we will talk about some of the links between mainstream pornography and domestic minor sex trafficking in the lives of Black girls and women, and a bit about intervention and prevention strategies for how we can combat this problem. So in the next slide, I'll tell you about the definition of domestic minor sex trafficking. So basically here we're talking about commercial sexual exploitation of children. So we're talking about the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, where the victim is a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident under the age of 18. So clearly we're talking about children here. But here's why this is significant when we think about racial disproportionality in terms of how we deal with sex trafficking. If we look at the next slide, we have found with research in multiple locations, this is from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that African American children, as we said, under the age of 18, but 59% of all prostitution arrests were African American children under the age of 18. They're really victims of domestic minor sex trafficking. But yet they're getting arrested, which is hugely problematic. If we look at the next slide, we also find similar racial disproportionality. When we look, this was also the U.S. Department of Justice. 40% of sex trafficking victims were identified as Black women. So there's a huge racial disproportionality to the problem of sex trafficking. And we look at the next slide about buyers of sex. What we found, this was a report that was published a couple of years ago. They actually interviewed men who purchased sex, and they asked buyers and traffickers and these individuals, they were primarily disproportionately purchasing or sexually victimizing young women of color, particularly African American girls and women. And so if we look at the next slide as well, and I find that too, where I am, I live in the Pacific Northwest in the Seattle-Tacoma area. And even though African Americans are a small part of the population in that area, disproportionately, they're more likely to be victims of domestic minor sex trafficking. So this problem with racial disproportionality exists across the country. So I've spent a lot of time really thinking about and researching why that may be. And the Urban Institute actually did a study where they asked sex traffickers, and they just clearly come out and say, well, we think we'll spend less time in jail and there will be less consequences for us if we're caught trafficking Black girls. So they would land in less time in jail, that there would be fewer consequences, legal consequences for them. And so they understand certainly how racism works in the culture. If we look at the next slide, it was very interesting to me that R. Kelly, so a popular celebrity and singer, there have been a number of documentaries made about his criminal behavior, and he's serving time in jail now. But the question was, how could he for so long get away with making pornography with girls, and these were minors, and distributing this all over the place, and nobody really pushed back or said anything, and people actually helped him do this. And if we look at the next slide, there were multiple news stories that came out, and one man who had been reporting on this story for years said he just realized when he tried to raise the alarm about this, it just reinforced to him that society really does not seem to care about this population, that Black girls can be overrepresented among victims of trafficking, sexual exploitation, pornography, all of these things, and there just doesn't seem to be much concern about that. And we'll talk about adultification of Black girls later in this presentation, which explains why individuals can do this and that there are so few consequences. If we look at the next slide, it's not just celebrities who are doing this. This was a DJ, and he actually posted on his social media where he's like, well, I've got hundreds of quote unquote bodies of young Black girls that he had sexual contact with. He was prostituting these young women, sex trafficking them, taking photos, posting this all over social media, clearly identifying what he was doing. And it took quite a long time for there to be any consequences for him. So it's not just celebrities, it permeates our entire culture. So if we look at the next slide, I worked on this project with Common Sense Media as a consultant. And one thing that I really wanted them to do is to have enough teens of color in the sample, and to also ask about racial stereotypes in pornography, because I thought that was really important. And what they did find is that kids are being exposed to pornography, but in particular, they're being exposed to these stereotypical images in pornography. And so that is really problematic in terms of shaping how they see themselves and how it shapes their sexuality. So much of my research is focused on that. So in the next slide, what we're finding, and which really prompted the research that I have been doing for the last few years, is that researchers actually asked young people between the ages of 16 and 18. These were low-income, urban, Black, and Latino youth. They were watching extreme pornography. They were watching for instructional purposes. They were modeling the behavior that they saw in pornography, and they felt really pressured to make pornography in these violent and healthy relationships, which really started to prompt me to think, well, what images are they seeing in pornography that we need to be aware of? So that really inspired me to do some of my more recent work. And so we look at the next slide. What I started to find over and over again is that pornography amplifies some of the worst sexual and racial stereotypes, and they feel like they can blatantly do this with no consequences. But I would argue that all of the images that we see in pornography are really deeply rooted in history. The images didn't come from nowhere. There's been a long history, hundreds of years of history of racial violence and terrorism against Black women, which gets amplified throughout our culture, popular culture. And it's worse in pornography, but it's literally everywhere. So it makes sense to me, sadly, why traffickers feel like they can victimize this population without consequences. So as I started to delve deeper into the pornography, if you look at the next slide, it prompted me to really think about how does pornography normalize and sexualize risk factors for trafficking? And I unpacked some of this in a documentary that I've been working on, Let Me Tell Y'all About Black Chicks, Images of Black Women in Pornography. And I'd like to share some of that research with you today. What I found, if we look at the next slide, what I actually found is that there are a lot of racial stereotypes in pornography, but what makes it so devastatingly bad is that Black women were more likely to be associated with prostitution and sex work than women of other ethnic backgrounds. And so if you go to websites like Adult DVD Empire, and you just type in words like hooker, for example, of the categories that pop up, 285 videos kind of focused on Black was associated with them. 327 Black women were associated with them. Now, other racial groups are sort of stereotyped in that way too, as sex workers, prostitutes, that kind of thing, but overwhelmingly, it is Black women. So I'll give you some examples in the next couple of slides and kind of really talk about like why I think that this is really problematic and devastating. So you'll see terms like ebony sex workers or Black girls working the streets were common titles of some of these videos. And if you look at the next slide, next slide. So they don't even sanitize it. They come right out really and say it, like, just treat me like a whore. She'll do things that your wife won't do. So these are women that you can treat in even more degrading ways because they're presumably sex workers and because of their ethnicity. And, you know, she's a hustling sister. She's willing to sell it to you, mister. She's a Black girl on a stroll. And if you got the cash, then you can purchase her. So the terminology, it's just so overt with the titles that nothing really is sanitized here. And in the next slide, we'll see that one series, Black Street Hookers, has been around for 17 years. You don't make 100, and they've got even more of these titles now. This was a couple of years ago. And so you're not going to be making 107 of the same video because 106 sold well. So you just keep making pretty much the same video over and over again. So this is a series that's been around for a very long time. And as we look at the next slide, it's not just adult women who are sort of trafficked in this way. Pornography also sexualizes domestic minor sex trafficking in videos such as Pimp My Black Teen. And notice they come right out and they're not even sanitizing it. They're saying exactly what it is pimping Black teenagers. In another series called Exploited Black Teens. So again, they're saying what it is that they're doing. It's not cleaned up or sanitized. And in this series of videos, Pimp My Black Teens, they actually give the teenagers a makeover where they sort of clean them up and just sort of make it seem like it's they're getting a makeover and then they're being sexualized and sold. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how pornography appears to really sexualize all the risk factors that are associated with domestic minor sex trafficking. If we look at the next slide, this is really critical in that we're seeing, we talk more about missing Indigenous women, which is a problem that we certainly need to be addressing. But we also need to be addressing the reality that Black girls and women are also disproportionately likely to go missing, and many of them may be trafficking victims and also murdered. And if you look at the next slide, we'll see that one risk factor for being trafficked is running away or being involved in the foster care system. And these are girls who are disproportionately targeted by sex traffickers, and then subsequently go missing. And what we'll see is that pornography tends to sexualize those particular risk factors. So take a look at this in the next slide. The title of this this porn video called Little Runaways. So Little Black Runaways, if you notice that pornography will tend to have young Black women sort of in low income areas, urban areas, distressed areas. And this one is called Little Black Runaways, and she's young and dumb. So it's like, here's a population who likely to be missing, likely to be in the foster care system. They've run away, so it's okay to sexually exploit them. And unfortunately, in the next slide, we'll see that, here's another example about how pornography sort of sexualizes domestic minor sexual trafficking and the risk of this. And Gail talked about just like these barely legal videos, and this one was a series called Black and Just Legal. And if you can just look at the text, not only the images, but the text that accompanies these. You know, how would you like to see young girls that are barely legal girls? They're saying that these are girls from the local food mart, or you know, fresh out of high school, you know, carrying their sweaty gym shorts, let loose from detention. You know, they're yours for the grabbing. So they're objectified in that way, fresh new faces. So kind of sexualizing, these are girls who are distressed and in trouble. So they're vulnerable to victimization. And if we look at the next slide, here's yet another example of that. Fresh off the plane or the bus, they're sexy beginners. So again, girls who maybe have run away from home, they're fresh off the bus, fresh off the plane, a sweet country girl. So traffickers prey on vulnerabilities. And so this is first time Black amateurs. So, and she looks, you know, very young and fresh faced. So pornography sort of sexualizes that it's okay to victimize these girls who are particularly vulnerable. And so in the next slide, we'll see how pornography sexualizes poverty. And that's a huge risk factor for being involved in pornography and being a victim of sex trafficking. So we look at the next slide. I'll say a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but what we see is that girls who come from distressed urban environments, we now know those to be coercive sexual environments, in that if you are in an environment where there's neighborhood disadvantage and poverty, and then you have high levels of community violence and a culture of gender-based violence, you're going to have what we call a coercive sexual environments that really push girls into pornography and make them more vulnerable to sex trafficking. And here's why this is so concerning, I believe, is that pornography, if we look in the next series of slides here, we'll see that what pornography does, it actually sexualizes these distressed urban areas. So you'll see porn videos like, this is all filmed in Chicago or Washington, D.C., or Compton or South Central hookers. So areas that are known for economically distressed problems and individuals. So if we look at the next slide, so it's kind of like, here's where you go if you want to engage in this behavior. And then on top of that, pornography will degrade economically disadvantaged Black women. So poor Black women are particularly degraded in pornography. So they'll be referred to as ghetto freaks or ghetto gaggers or urban hoochies or inner city sluts or hood rats. So if you can then dehumanize these women, then it's easier for them to go missing, to sex traffic them, to victimize them in all kinds of ways, because they're not really human beings in this pornified world. So if you look at the next slide, I think you can really see the links here. So this is in Atlanta. So this young woman's name, porn name is Little Baby. So again, you're sexualizing very young women. So she's cute looking, extra hot. She's from Atlanta. But then if you go look at the research and understand that there's a huge sex trafficking problem in Atlanta, because for a variety of reasons, there are a lot of sex-oriented businesses, a lot of tourism, easy airport to get in and out, a lot of sporting events. And so tourists coming in and out, but what they're doing is sexualizing that in a really problematic way. So I'm not surprised that there is a big problem with sex trafficking in those communities. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see how pornography not only sexualizes these urban communities, pornography also celebrates pimping. So you'll even see the name of the videos turned out. So the terms that are actually used in pimping and domestic minor sex trafficking, so turning young women out to sort of put them out onto the stroll and to sell them for sex. So Black teen sluts are getting pimped out for the first time, turning tricks in the hood, back alleys, seedy strip clubs. The terminology, screaming like wild animals. So again, that dehumanization is very clear in pornography of very young girls, so very much linked to sex trafficking. So let me give you another example of that in the next slide. So if you're in these urban areas, what ends up happening is that some young women may engage in what we call survival sex. So you're not selling sex because you want to, but because you have no access to economic resources. And porn will actually take mainstream movies and sort of create a spoof or a parody or a comedy of these mainstream movies. So a couple of years ago, there was a movie called Precious about this young Black girl who was sexually assaulted by her stepfather and became HIV positive as a result. And so pornography made a spoof or a comedy of this video. And the text was like, when a chick grows up in the inner city, it's a rough life, but you can sort of get ahead. Actually, the road out of urban blight is really just a matter of performing sex acts. So the notion if you just use your sexuality, you can get away from poverty. So basically what the porn industry here is doing is that they're normalizing, celebrating, trivializing survival sex. And that is hugely problematic. If we look at the next slide, we'll see another example of that as well. It's a Black daddy thing. So be nice and daddy will give you a treat. Daddy loves his girls. And so daddy's a common term for pimps. And so the whole thing is like, you can get a daddy, be a sugar baby, and find people, men who will give you really nice things. So you can't really see, I'm not sure, in the image, she's standing right next to a very expensive vehicle. So if you sell yourself, then you can get all these wonderful houses or cars or very nice things. And of course, that's not the case. So you don't get to keep these things, you don't get these things, but it normalizes survival sex. If we look at the next image, comes from a documentary that was on sex trafficking in Black girls. And this young woman said, well, I got upset when I realized what he was doing, but I kept doing it because I thought I was special. Okay, if you go to the next slide. What we're seeing here is oftentimes traffickers will pick up on what we call internalized racism and colorism. The reason that she felt such low self-esteem was because of her weight and physical appearance, and particularly her dark skin tone. And so there's not a lot of research here, but what we find is that these young women felt like they had so little value, and traffickers were able to pick up on that. And we see that get played out in pornography as well. So if we look at the next slide. So basically, colorism is the practice of discrimination by which those who are lighter skin are treated more favorably than those with darker skin. And that's throughout history and many other racial groups. But we see pornography picking up on that as well. If we look at the next slide, I'll give you a couple examples of what that looks like. Lighter skinned women in pornography will be referred to as beautiful, pretty, more desirable. Here's what happens with darker skinned Black women in pornography in the next slide. They're referred to as ghetto hood rats or urban hoochies or nappy-headed hoes. And so darker skinned Black women are sort of at the bottom of the beauty hierarchy throughout society, and that happens in pornography as well. So Black girls, based on their physical appearance, may be more victimized in that way and more vulnerable to sex trafficking because of self-esteem issues. And so we look at the next slide. There was a study that came out a couple of years ago that looked at the links between, I'm seeing some things about survival sex. So maybe we can, I'll wrap this up soon and we can have a conversation about this. But what we're finding is that the link between domestic violence, domestic minor sex trafficking, and dating violence, that feeling physically unattractive, and also being flattered by romantic gestures or dating someone of higher status. But here, one thing that kind of kept these young women involved in this is that they got some self-esteem by out-earning other sex workers. And pornography will sexualize that as well. If you look at the next slide, here's how they describe this. Pimps, and Pimpin' and Hoeing was the name of the video. And it said these bitches wanted top hoe status and so that's how traffickers keep these young women engaged as well, because it's like, if I have no self-esteem because of my physical appearance, I can have some self-esteem if I out earn other traffic victims. And so that's really problematic, but porn will play on that as well. So I thought that was really devastating as well. So the next slide. We'll see branding, even that this woman was actually branded with, like, pimp my hide. She was branded with my bitch. And so with tattoos, and pornography also picks up on that as well. So kind of normalizes that as well. So let's move on to the next slide. And then I'll tell you about what are some things that we can do to address this problem. We're seeing women being trafficked right out of jail. So traffickers are finding these very vulnerable women who are in jail, making contact with them. So when they get out, then they can force them into prostitution. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see how pornography even sexualizes that out on bail. So, they just got out of jail, so sexually exploit them as well. So pimps and traffickers know how to get access to women who are formerly incarcerated, again, the most vulnerable women who don't have choices. So if we kind of skip ahead here, let's skip ahead here, and then maybe we can have a conversation about survival sex and how all of this in the next slide as well. I think what we have to do is we have to get more educated about racial disproportionality in pornography. So this was an older study, but it found, and these were when videos were on VHS, so a much older study, they found that Black girls between 14 and 18 were exposed to X-rated movies, about 30% of them in this study, but that was linked to negative attitudes toward condoms, having multiple sex partners, more frequent intercourse, less contraceptive use, and desire to become pregnancy, testing positive for chlamydia, and exposure to dating violence. Here's more recent research that I've been working on more recently in the next slide, and you can get access to this on my website. I looked at pornography consumers of color and how that can impact young people. So that's available on my website, which I'll make available to you after this presentation. So I think we have to look at how this particularly impacts young people of color. The next slide.
Carolyn, we have about 10 minutes left, including time for Q&A. So were there particular slides you wanted to make sure we covered?
I did. I wanted the most important slides here. If you could skip ahead, let's talk about adultification. Skip ahead to adult perceptions about Black girls.
You know what slide number that is?
That is 47.
Okay, thank you.
Because
we want to leave time for some Q&A. There's some good questions in
definitely. What I would say is that we have to look, the most critical thing here is we have to look at how adults see young Black women, because that means that they're not getting the help that they need. And so there was a study done called Black Girlhood Interrupted, where adults perceive Black girls as needing less nurturing, protection, less support, less comfort, more independent, and knowing more about adult topics. And so if you skip ahead to the very last slide, and we'll stop it here and have some conversation and ask some questions. Oh, not slide 48. Go back some more. Yes. And so I think part of it is that if we're going to do this work, not only getting more educated about pornography, more educated about adultification and how that makes Black girls very vulnerable. So understanding the implicit biases we have that gets permeated throughout porn so that we can address both pornography and sex trafficking.